Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into one of history's darkest chapters, where paranoia ruled the streets and a single sideways glance could literally cost you your life. Picture this: you're walking down a dirt road in Salem Village, Massachusetts, and the year is 1692. The air feels thick with more than just New England humidity. It's saturated with fear, suspicion, and the kind of religious fervor that makes people see devils in every shadow. Children are convulsing in the streets, pointing accusing fingers at their neighbors, and the local magistrates are writing death warrants faster than a modern-day traffic cop issues speeding tickets. You probably think you'd handle this situation better than the average 17th century villager, right? Maybe you'd be the voice of reason, the one person who could talk sense into this madness. Well, here's your reality check. You wouldn't last 12 hours before someone pointed a finger at you and screamed. Witch. The Salem Witch Trials weren't just about supernatural beliefs. They were a perfect storm of social tension, economic rivalry, and mass hysteria that would chew up and spit out anyone who didn't fit their extremely narrow definition of normal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see our global night owl community come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just materialized in Salem Village on February 29th, 1692. Yes, it's a leap year, which some superstitious locals might already consider an omen. The first thing that hits you isn't the smell of wood smoke or farm animals, but the oppressive weight of everyone's stare. In a community of barely 500 souls, every face is known, every family tree memorized, and every stranger is automatically suspect. You're wearing clothes that scream outsider, maybe jeans and a t-shirt, perhaps sneakers that squeak on the frozen ground. Your hair is styled in ways that won't be invented for centuries, and you're carrying yourself with a confidence that immediately marks you as different. The village itself looks like something from a historical documentary, except grimmer and smaller than you imagined. Most buildings are simple wooden structures with thatched roofs, and the roads are nothing more than muddy paths carved by countless wagon wheels. The meeting house dominates the center of town like a stern wooden guardian, its bell tower reaching toward heaven as if trying to pull the entire community closer to God through sheer architectural determination. But here's what the history books don't always emphasize. Salem in 1692 isn't just dealing with witch trials. It's a community already stretched to its breaking point. King William's War is raging on the frontier, sending streams of refugees fleeing toward coastal towns. The weather has been unusually harsh, crops have failed, and everyone's nerves are frayed thinner than overused parchment. Historians still argue whether the afflicted girls were genuinely experiencing some form of mass psychogenic illness or deliberately manipulating the situation. But from your perspective as a confused time traveler, the distinction is academic. What matters is that 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams have already started their mysterious fits, and the local minister Samuel Parris is convinced that supernatural forces are attacking his household. The village is like a powder keg, and your very presence, foreign, unexplained, and impossible to categorize, is exactly the spark needed to set everything ablaze. The moment you open your mouth, you've sealed your fate. Your accent, whether it's modern American English, British, or something else entirely, sounds completely foreign to Puritan ears. You probably use contractions without thinking, drop casual profanity, and speak to men and women with equal familiarity. In 1692 Salem, this linguistic cocktail brands you as either a foreigner with suspicious allegiances or, worse yet, someone whose very speech patterns suggest otherworldly influence. Your clothing situation goes from bad to catastrophic within minutes. Those comfortable jeans? Puritans consider anything that reveals the shape of legs to be scandalously immodest, regardless of gender. If you're a woman wearing pants, you've just committed what they view as an abomination against God's natural order. Your t-shirt, with its probably colorful design and definitely synthetic fabric, looks like nothing anyone has ever seen. The texture feels wrong under their fingers, the colors are too vibrant, and any printed graphics or text might as well be hieroglyphics from another planet. The Puritan dress code isn't just about fashion. It's a rigid system of social control that communicates your place in both earthly and heavenly hierarchies. Men wear dark, simple clothing with minimal decoration, while women cover themselves from neck to ankle in layers of heavy fabric. Colors are muted browns, grays, and blacks, with the occasional deep blue for those who can afford it. Your bright clothing suggests either dangerous vanity or supernatural assistance in acquiring such unusual materials. Even your posture gives you away. You stand with modern confidence, make direct eye contact with authority figures, and probably slouch in ways that 17th century etiquette finds appalling. Puritan children are trained from infancy to demonstrate physical deference through their bearing, shoulders back but head slightly bowed, hands clasped respectfully, eyes downcast when addressing superiors. Your casual body language screams disrespect for both human authority and divine order. Your personal hygiene creates another layer of suspicion. You're probably cleaner than most Salem residents, with straighter teeth and fewer visible signs of malnutrition or disease. This unusual healthiness might initially seem like an advantage, but in a community where suffering is viewed as spiritually purifying, your obvious well-being suggests either sinful self-indulgence or diabolic assistance. That dental work? Those unmarked hands that clearly haven't spent years doing manual labor? Pure evidence of supernatural intervention. The mainstream historical consensus shows that Puritans valued community conformity above individual expression, viewing deviation as a potential threat to their precarious spiritual and physical survival. But here's a quirky detail that often gets overlooked. Many Salem residents were actually more fashion-conscious than their stereotypical image suggests, importing fabrics and styles from Boston and Europe when they could afford them. However, this makes your completely alien appearance even more problematic. You're not just poorly dressed, you're dressed in materials and styles that don't exist anywhere in their known world. Your speech patterns betray you in subtler ways too. You probably use modern grammatical constructions, contemporary idioms, and casual profanity that would shock 17th century sensibilities. When someone asks about your family or origin, your fumbling attempts to explain will only deepen their suspicions. You can't name local families, don't know regional geography, and your stories about where you came from sound increasingly fantastic with each attempt at clarification. Historians still argue whether the Salem accusations followed specific patterns or emerged more randomly, but your complete inability to demonstrate proper Puritan social behavior makes you a perfect target regardless of the underlying dynamics. You don't know the unspoken rules about deference to church elders, can't recite appropriate Bible verses for common situations, and probably respond to religious discussions with modern skepticism that sounds blasphemous to devout ears. The religious knowledge gap creates the most dangerous problems. Every Puritan child memorizes extensive biblical passages, can discuss complex theological concepts, and understands their community's particular interpretation of Calvinist doctrine. Your inability to participate in these discussions, or worse, your tendency to question religious assumptions, marks you as someone operating outside God's grace. In a community where spiritual failing often implies diabolic influence, your obvious religious ignorance becomes damning evidence of supernatural corruption. Your stomach starts growling around mid-morning, and that's when you realize that finding food in Salem Village isn't as simple as wandering into a convenience store. The entire food distribution system operates on networks of family relationships, community standing, and economic arrangements that you have absolutely no access to. You can't just walk up to someone's house and ask to buy bread. First, because most families bake their own, and second, because conducting business with a complete stranger requires references, guarantees, and social vouching that you simply cannot provide. The local tavern might seem like your best bet for a meal, but even this requires navigating complex social protocols. You need to demonstrate that you're a respectable person worthy of service, which means providing information about your family, your business in town, and your religious affiliation. When you can't answer these basic questions satisfactorily, the tavern keeper grows suspicious. Your offer to pay with modern currency, whether paper money or contemporary coins, only deepens the mystery. The metal composition, minting techniques, and design elements of your money are completely foreign, suggesting either counterfeiting or, more ominously, supernatural origins. Water presents an even more immediate challenge than food. Salem residents get their water from private wells, streams, and a few public sources, but accessing these requires either property ownership or community permission. You can't just help yourself to someone's well water without risking accusations of theft or trespassing. The public water sources are often contaminated or controlled by local authorities who want to know exactly who you are before granting access. Your request for clean drinking water, using modern terminology about sanitation and safety, sounds like evidence of unusual knowledge that could be interpreted as supernatural insight. Finding shelter becomes your most pressing concern as evening approaches. Salem doesn't have hotels or boarding houses in the modern sense. Travelers typically stay with family connections, carry letters of introduction to respectable households, or arrange accommodation through business or religious networks. You have none of these resources, and your requests for paid lodging confuse and alarm potential hosts. Your willingness to sleep anywhere, your lack of concern about proper gender segregation, and your unfamiliarity with household prayer routines make you seem dangerously unpredictable. The mainstream historical record shows that Salem Village operated on a tight-knit system of mutual dependence and surveillance, where everyone's daily activities were known and monitored by their neighbors. But here's a fascinating detail that often gets overlooked. Many Salem families supplemented their income by taking in travelers, craftsmen, and temporary workers, creating a more fluid population than the stereotypical image of an isolated Puritan community might suggest. However, this system depended entirely on personal recommendations and social verification, resources you completely lack. Your attempts to find work reveal another layer of impossibility. Every trade and craft operates through apprenticeship systems, guild-like associations, and family connections that require years of preparation and community integration. You can't just offer to help with farm work because you don't know local agricultural techniques, seasonal patterns, or the complex social relationships that govern labor exchange. Your modern skills, computer literacy, driving ability, knowledge of contemporary technology, are not just useless but actively suspicious when you try to explain them. Even basic navigation becomes treacherous without local knowledge. Salem's roads are unmarked paths that residents navigate through memorized landmarks and geographical relationships developed over generations. When you ask for directions using modern terminology or reference points that don't exist, people start wondering how you arrived in town without knowing the basic layout. Your confusion about local geography suggests either deception about your origins or supernatural transportation that bypasses normal travel routes. Historians still argue whether Salem's economic tensions contributed more to the witch trials than religious factors. But your complete inability to participate in the local economy makes you an obvious outsider regardless of the underlying causes. You can't buy food, find shelter, earn money, or even locate basic necessities without revealing your fundamental alienation from 17th century life. The weather compounds every other challenge you face. February in Massachusetts is brutally cold, and your modern clothing provides inadequate protection against the harsh conditions. You need warm shelter, proper clothing, and regular meals to survive, But accessing these necessities requires exactly the social connections and community standing that you cannot establish. Your visible discomfort with the cold, your inappropriate clothing, and your desperate attempts to find warmth make you appear increasingly suspicious to observers who are already questioning your presence in their community. By your second day in Salem, someone has noticed your strange behavior, and in a community where gossip travels faster than a modern internet meme, that's all it takes. Maybe it's the way you flinched when Goodwife Corey mentioned the devil during casual conversation, or how you awkwardly avoided joining the group prayer before the communal meal. Perhaps someone caught you muttering modern curse words under your breath, or noticed how you instinctively reached for a pocket that should contain a smartphone. Whatever the trigger, the whispers have started, and in Salem Village, whispers about unusual behavior have a nasty habit of evolving into formal accusations. The accusation process begins deceptively quietly. It might start with young Mercy Lewis claiming she saw your specter, pinching her during the night, or Little and Putnam Jr. insisting that an invisible version of you forced her to sign the devil's book. The beauty of spectral evidence, if you're a witch hunter, is that you don't need to physically be anywhere near your alleged victims to be guilty of tormenting them. Your spirit, according to Puritan theology, can travel independently to cause mischief while your body remains visible to witnesses elsewhere. This means that having an alibi becomes meaningless, since supernatural attacks operate outside normal physical limitations. The afflicted girls of Salem have developed their symptoms into a terrifyingly effective performance art. When your name gets mentioned in their presence, they might suddenly convulse, scream about invisible hands choking them, or claim to see birds flying around your head that only they can perceive. Their reactions appear genuine to most observers. The physical contortions, the apparent terror, the specific details they provide about their supernatural torment. Whether these symptoms represent deliberate fraud, mass hysteria, or something else entirely becomes irrelevant once the community decides you're responsible for causing them. Your modern skepticism about their claims only makes things worse. When you suggest that maybe these girls are mistaken, or that their symptoms might have natural explanations, you're essentially accusing them of lying about their religious experiences. In Puritan theology, questioning someone's spiritual encounters implies either dangerous rationalism or active participation in the diabolic forces attacking the community. Your reasonable doubt becomes evidence of your supernatural guilt rather than proof of your innocence. The mainstream historical understanding shows that Salem's accusations often targeted people who were already marginally positioned in the community. The poor, the elderly, those involved in property disputes, or anyone who had previously challenged local authority. But here's an intriguing detail that researchers sometimes overlook. Several accused witches were actually well-respected community members with strong religious reputations, suggesting that the accusation process could target anyone once the hysteria gained momentum. Your complete ignorance of local social dynamics makes you vulnerable in ways that even the most marginalized Salem residents could avoid. You don't know which families are feuding, can't identify the subtle political alliances that shape community decisions, and have no understanding of the economic rivalries that often motivate accusations. When someone points a finger at you, you lack the social knowledge to understand why you've been targeted or how to respond effectively. The timing of your arrival creates additional suspicion. You appeared in Salem just as the witch trials were beginning, making you either remarkably unlucky or, more likely in local minds, directly connected to the supernatural forces plaguing their community. Your inability to explain where you came from, why you're here, or how you traveled to Salem without anyone seeing you along the way suggests either deception or magical transportation. Neither possibility reflects well on your chances of survival. Historians still argue whether the Salem accusers believed their own claims or consciously manipulated the situation for personal advantage, but your reaction to being accused reveals your fundamental misunderstanding of the social dynamics at play. You probably respond with modern legal thinking, demanding evidence, questioning the accuser's credibility, or appealing to rational standards of proof. This approach backfires spectacularly in a community where spiritual truth supersedes material evidence, and where challenging the afflicted girl's testimonies implies sympathy for diabolic forces. Your body language during the accusation betrays your guilt in Puritan eyes. You might laugh nervously, roll your eyes at particularly absurd claims, or display the kind of casual disrespect for authority that modern people consider normal. These reactions confirm local suspicions that you operate outside their community's spiritual and social boundaries. Even your confusion appears suspicious. Surely an innocent person would be more shocked and less bewildered by false accusations of witchcraft. The speed with which accusations escalate catches you completely off guard. What starts as neighborhood gossip can transform into formal charges within days. And once the magistrates become involved, the legal machinery begins grinding toward its predetermined conclusion. Your lack of family connections in Salem Village creates a social vulnerability that 17th century residents would find almost inconceivable. Every legitimate person in their world can trace their lineage, name their relatives, and identify their place within extended kinship networks that stretch across New England and back to specific English parishes. When pressed to explain your family background, your fumbling responses about distant relatives or vague geographic origins sound increasingly suspicious with each retelling. You can't name your grandfather's occupation, don't know which ship your family arrived on, and have no idea about your ancestral parish records. Information that any respectable colonist could recite from memory. The Puritan social system operates on the assumption that good character runs in bloodlines, while moral corruption tends to be hereditary. Your inability to demonstrate proper family credentials suggests either shameful origins that you're trying to hide or, more ominously, supernatural parentage that places you outside normal human genealogy. When magistrates ask about your parents' religious standing, their reputation in the community, or their relationships with local ministers, your blank stares confirm their worst suspicions about your background. Church membership provides another layer of social protection that you completely lack. Every respectable Salem resident can identify their religious affiliation, describe their conversion experience, and name the ministers who have guided their spiritual development. Your inability to discuss your relationship with God in proper theological terminology, your confusion about Puritan doctrine, and your obvious unfamiliarity with biblical passages mark you as someone operating outside the community's spiritual boundaries. When you can't recite basic prayers, don't know the correct responses during religious services, and fail to demonstrate appropriate reverence during devotional moments, people start questioning whether you've ever been properly exposed to Christian influence. The economic dimension of social standing creates additional problems for your survival. Legitimate residents own property, maintain credit relationships with local merchants, or work within established trade networks that provide both income and social verification. You have no property deeds, no business partnerships, no craft guild memberships, and no economic relationships that would vouch for your character and stability. Your offers to pay for goods and services with mysterious currency only deepen suspicions about how you acquired such unusual resources. Here's a fascinating detail that often gets overlooked in popular accounts. Salem Village had been experiencing significant social stratification in the decades before the witch trials, with newer residents, failed farmers, and people without established family connections increasingly marginalized within the community's power structure. However, even these marginalized residents had some form of social connection. Distant relatives, former employers, or religious sponsors who could provide minimal character references. You have absolutely nothing. Your age and marital status create another layer of social anomaly. Whether you appear young or old to 17th century eyes, your unmarried state and lack of dependence seem unnatural in a society where family formation represents both economic necessity and religious obligation. If you appear to be of marriageable age but lack a spouse, people wonder what prevents you from forming normal social bonds. If you seem older without children or grandchildren, your solitary state suggests either personal failings that make you unsuitable for family life or supernatural circumstances that prevent normal human relationships. The political connections that might protect other residents from accusations are completely unavailable to you. You don't know which families support the current minister, can't identify the factional alliances that shape village politics, and have no understanding of the property disputes and inheritance conflicts that motivate many accusations. When political tensions escalate into supernatural charges, you lack the social networks that might provide protection or the knowledge necessary to navigate competing loyalties safely. Historians still argue whether Salem's social divisions contributed more to the witch trials than religious factors. But your complete isolation from all social networks makes you vulnerable regardless of the underlying causes. You can't claim protection from powerful families, religious authorities, or economic partners because you have no relationships with any of these groups. Your gender affects your vulnerability in complex ways that you probably don't fully understand. If you're a woman, your unmarried state and lack of male protection makes you an easy target for accusations, while your failure to demonstrate proper feminine deference to male authority confirms suspicions about your character. If you're a man, your inability to establish your place within the masculine hierarchy of property ownership, craft expertise, or military service makes you appear weak and potentially dangerous. When the magistrates finally summon you for examination, you discover that Salem's legal proceedings operate according to rules that would make a modern lawyer weep with frustration. The examination isn't designed to determine your guilt or innocence. It's structured to extract a confession and identify your alleged accomplices in the diabolic conspiracy plaguing their community. Magistrate William Stoughton and his colleagues approach your case with the firm conviction that witches exist, that they're actively harming Salem residents, and that uncovering their identities serves God's will in protecting the faithful. The examination begins with questions that seem reasonable enough. Your name, your residence, your business in Salem Village. But each honest answer creates new problems for your defense. When you can't provide local references, your responses sound evasive. When you try to explain your modern origins, your story becomes increasingly fantastic. The magistrates interpret your confusion and contradictory statements as evidence of diabolic confusion, a well-known symptom of witchcraft that prevents accused individuals from maintaining consistent lies about their supernatural activities. Your body language during questioning violates every expectation of proper courtroom behavior. You probably make direct eye contact with the magistrates, speak in a casual tone that lacks appropriate deference, and display the kind of confident posture that 17th century court proceedings interpret as arrogant defiance of legitimate authority. When you gesture while speaking, cross your arms defensively, or show visible frustration with the questioning, observers note these reactions as evidence of your unrepentant character and probable guilt. The presence of the afflicted girls during your examination creates a theatrical atmosphere that makes rational defense nearly impossible. When you're brought before them, they immediately begin their dramatic performances, convulsing, screaming, claiming that your specter is pinching or choking them even as you stand motionless in the courtroom. Their reactions appear genuine to most observers, and your obvious skepticism about their symptoms only confirms suspicions that you're responsible for causing their torment. Here's a chilling detail that many popular accounts overlook. The examination process often continued for hours, with magistrates rotating questions, afflicted girls providing ongoing commentary about invisible attacks, and spectators offering observations about the accused person's behavior and appearance. The psychological pressure of this sustained interrogation, combined with physical discomfort from standing for extended periods and the hostile atmosphere of the courtroom, broke down many innocent defendants' ability to maintain coherent responses. The magistrates employ questioning techniques specifically designed to trap suspected witches in contradictory statements. They might ask the same question multiple ways, looking for inconsistencies in your responses. They probe for knowledge about local people and events that you shouldn't possess, while simultaneously demanding explanations for your ignorance about basic community information. When you can't answer their questions satisfactorily, they interpret your confusion as either deceptive evasion or supernatural mental interference. Your modern understanding of legal rights becomes a liability rather than an asset. When you ask about legal representation, demand to see evidence against you, or invoke concepts like presumption of innocence, you're requesting protections that don't exist in 17th century Massachusetts legal proceedings. The magistrates view these demands as evidence of your familiarity with diabolic legal systems rather than legitimate requests for fair treatment. The theological framework governing your examination assumes that God will reveal truth through the proceedings, meaning that any outcome serves divine justice. If you confess, your admission proves the magistrate's wisdom in identifying a genuine witch. If you maintain your innocence, your refusal to acknowledge obvious evidence of your guilt demonstrates the diabolic pride and deception characteristic of unrepentant witches. Either way, the examination process validates the court's assumptions about supernatural threats to the community. Historians still argue whether Salem's magistrates genuinely believed in their procedures or cynically manipulated the legal system for political purposes. But your experience as a confused defendant reveals the practical impossibility of mounting an effective defense within their framework. You can't provide the social credentials that might protect you, can't explain your presence in ways that sound credible to 17th century ears, and can't respond to theological questions with appropriate knowledge and reverence. The physical environment of the examination adds another layer of intimidation that modern people rarely consider. The meeting house where proceedings take place is packed with hostile spectators, poorly ventilated, and dominated by the magistrate's elevated position that emphasizes their authority over your subordinate status. The most insidious aspect of Salem's legal proceedings is their reliance on spectral evidence, testimony about crimes allegedly committed by your invisible spirit while your physical body was elsewhere. This concept operates according to Puritan theological beliefs that the devil can assume the shape of innocent people to commit evil acts, but that God would never allow truly innocent souls to be impersonated for diabolic purposes. Therefore, if multiple witnesses claim to see your specter tormenting them, their testimony becomes virtually unassailable proof of your guilt, regardless of any physical evidence or alibi you might present. The afflicted girls describe your spectral visits with terrifying specificity. They claim your invisible form appeared in their bedrooms at midnight, pinching and choking them until they agreed to sign the devil's book. They describe the clothes your specter wore, the words it spoke, and the specific torments it inflicted. Some even claim your spirit brought them poppets, small dolls used in sympathetic magic, or forced them to participate in diabolic sacraments that mock Christian communion. These detailed accounts sound convincing to listeners who believe in the reality of spiritual warfare and supernatural manifestation. Your physical appearance during the examination becomes evidence against you in ways that seem almost comically arbitrary to modern sensibilities. When the afflicted girls look at you, they might claim to see supernatural creatures perched on your shoulders, invisible birds, cats, or other diabolic familiars that only their spiritually sensitive eyes can perceive. They describe these creatures whispering instructions to you, feeding from your body, or threatening them when they try to testify about your crimes. Your inability to see these alleged creatures only proves that you're spiritually blind to your own diabolic companions. The court also accepts evidence about your dreams and their supposed effects on other people's sleep. Witnesses testify that they experienced nightmares after encountering you, that their children suffered night terrors following your visits, or that livestock became agitated when you passed their property. In Puritan understanding, these disturbances suggest that your spiritual presence carries diabolic influence that affects both humans and animals even when you're not consciously directing supernatural attacks. Here's a particularly bizarre detail that demonstrates the breadth of spectral evidence. Some accusers claimed that suspected witches' specters appeared at locations hundreds of miles away, committing crimes in distant communities while the accused individuals remained visible in Salem. The court accepted these geographically impossible accusations as evidence of witchcraft's power to transcend normal physical limitations, rather than questioning the credibility of witnesses who claimed to identify specific individuals across such vast distances. Your attempts to disprove spectral evidence backfire in predictable ways. When you point out the logical impossibilities in the accusations, how you couldn't possibly have been in multiple places simultaneously, or how the described events violate basic physical laws, the magistrates interpret your rational objections as evidence of your sophisticated understanding of diabolic powers. Only someone intimately familiar with supernatural abilities would know enough about their limitations to construct such clever defenses. The theological framework supporting spectral evidence creates an intellectual trap that even educated defendants couldn't escape. If you deny the charges, you're calling the afflicted girls liars about their spiritual experiences, which implies either that you doubt the reality of supernatural phenomena or that you're actively protecting the diabolic forces attacking the community. If you acknowledge the possibility of spectral evidence while maintaining your innocence, you're essentially arguing that God allows innocent people to be falsely accused through supernatural means, a position that challenges divine justice and providence. Historians still argue whether Salem's acceptance of spectral evidence reflected genuine theological conviction or convenient legal expedient, but from your perspective as a bewildered defendant, the distinction becomes meaningless. You're facing accusations that you cannot possibly refute through conventional means, based on evidence that exists only in the spiritual realm that you don't even believe exists. The cumulative effect of multiple spectral evidence testimonies creates an overwhelming impression of guilt that physical evidence cannot counteract. When witness after witness describes similar supernatural encounters with your spirit, their consistent accounts appear to confirm each other's credibility. The fact that these witnesses often describe details about your appearance, clothing, or behavior that they shouldn't know becomes additional proof of genuine supernatural contact rather than evidence of collusion or shared delusion. Salem's jail makes modern maximum security prisons look like luxury resorts. Located in a cramped, poorly constructed building that was never designed for long-term human habitation, the facility crams dozens of accused witches into spaces barely adequate for storing grain. The walls leak during rainstorms, allowing February's bitter cold to seep through every crack and crevice. There's no heating system beyond whatever body warmth the overcrowded prisoners can generate, and the primitive ventilation means that the air quickly becomes thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the sickly sweet odor of infected wounds that can't heal properly in such unsanitary conditions. Your modern immune system, despite its advantages, faces bacterial and viral challenges that 17th century medicine cannot address. The jail's water supply comes from questionable sources. The food consists of whatever scraps families can afford to bring their imprisoned relatives, and the waste disposal system amounts to buckets that are emptied irregularly depending on the jailer's mood and availability. Dysentery spreads rapidly through the confined population, along with respiratory infections that turn deadly in the damp, cold environment. You watch fellow prisoners develop festering sores, experience violent coughing fits, and gradually waste away from malnutrition and disease. The psychological torture of Salem's imprisonment begins with the complete uncertainty about your fate. Some prisoners have been waiting months for trial, while others disappear suddenly when their cases are called. You have no access to legal counsel, no reliable information about court schedules, and no way to communicate with potential supporters outside the jail. The isolation from normal human contact, combined with the constant fear of execution, creates a mental pressure that breaks down even strong personalities within weeks of confinement. Your cellmates represent a cross-section of Salem's accused population, and their stories reveal the arbitrary nature of the accusations plaguing the community. You might share space with Sarah Good, whose poverty and sharp tongue made her an easy target for neighborhood grudges, or Rebecca Nurse, whose piety and social standing couldn't protect her once the accusations gained momentum. Some prisoners maintain their innocence with religious fervor, while others have already confessed to imaginary crimes in hopes of avoiding execution. The constant debates about confession, guilt, and survival strategies create an atmosphere of paranoia and desperation that makes rational planning nearly impossible. Here's a grim detail that popular accounts often sanitize. Many prisoners died in jail before their trials concluded, succumbing to the brutal conditions, inadequate medical care, and psychological stress of prolonged confinement. The authorities viewed these deaths as either divine judgment on the guilty or unfortunate casualties in the larger battle against diabolic forces threatening the community. Either way, dying in jail spared the community the expense and moral complexity of executing someone who might potentially be innocent. The jail's fee structure adds another layer of cruelty to an already desperate situation. Prisoners must pay for their own confinement, including charges for food, bedding, heating fuel, and even the chains used to restrain them. Your inability to provide these payments means experiencing the worst conditions the facility can offer. Sleeping on bare floors, receiving minimal food rations, and going without the small comforts that might make imprisonment slightly more bearable. The jailer, who depends on these fees for his income, has no incentive to provide decent treatment for prisoners who cannot pay for better accommodations. Physical restraints add to your suffering in ways that modern people rarely consider. Heavy iron shackles around your ankles make walking difficult and sleeping nearly impossible. The metal chafes against your skin, creating wounds that become infected in the unsanitary environment. Your hands might be bound with rope or chains that prevent you from eating, cleaning yourself, or finding comfortable positions during the long hours of confinement. These restraints serve both practical and psychological purposes, preventing escape while demonstrating your status as a dangerous criminal who requires constant control. Historians still argue whether Salem's harsh imprisonment conditions reflected deliberate cruelty or simply the limited resources available for managing suspected criminals. But your experience reveals how the physical suffering weakens your ability to mount an effective defense. Chronic pain, malnutrition, and sleep deprivation impair your judgment and memory, making it harder to maintain consistent responses to interrogation and more likely that you'll eventually confess to crimes you didn't commit simply to end the torment. The social dynamics within the jail create additional stress as prisoners compete for limited resources and form temporary alliances based on survival needs rather than friendship or shared values. The touch test represents one of Salem's most bizarre and invasive procedures for identifying witches, based on the belief that supernatural afflictions will cease when victims make physical contact with their tormentors. When the afflicted girls are brought before you during your examination, they writhe and convulse dramatically, claiming that your specter continues to pinch and choke them even as you stand motionless across the room. The magistrates then order you to approach these victims and place your hands upon them, watching carefully to see if your touch relieves their supernatural suffering. Your modern understanding of personal boundaries makes this forced contact particularly disturbing. You're required to touch young girls and women without their consent, in full view of the community's male authorities, while everyone scrutinizes your facial expressions and body language for signs of guilt or supernatural power. The touch test assumes that witches cannot resist the compulsion to relieve their victims' suffering when given the opportunity, meaning that any improvement in the afflicted girl's condition proves your guilt, while continued suffering suggests you're deliberately maintaining your diabolic attacks out of spite. The examination of your body for devil's marks violates every concept of privacy and dignity that modern people consider fundamental rights. Court-appointed searchers, usually older women whose own reputations depend on their thoroughness, strip you completely naked and examine every inch of your skin for unusual marks, moles, scars, or blemishes that might indicate where diabolic familiars have sucked your blood in exchange for supernatural powers. Your birthmarks become evidence of diabolic nursing, while any cuts, scratches, or insect bites suggest recent contact with supernatural creatures. The searchers probe your body with pins and needles, looking for areas of insensitive flesh that supposedly mark locations where the devil has touched you. They examine your most intimate areas with clinical detachment, discussing your anatomy in front of male magistrates as if you're livestock being evaluated at market. Any unusual physical characteristics, scars from modern medical procedures, dental work, or even something as simple as a vaccination mark, become evidence of supernatural intervention that 17th century bodies would never naturally display. Your reaction to this humiliating examination provides additional evidence for the court to interpret. If you remain calm and cooperative, they view your composure as unnatural coldness that suggests diabolic influence over your emotions. If you show embarrassment, anger, or distress, they interpret these responses as evidence of your shame about diabolic markings or your fury at being discovered. Your modern sensibility about bodily autonomy and sexual privacy makes you respond in ways that 17th century observers find suspicious regardless of your specific reactions. Here's a particularly disturbing detail that demonstrates the examination's invasive nature. Searchers specifically looked for supernatural teats in genital areas, believing that witches possessed extra nipples for nursing diabolic familiars. Any natural variation in anatomy, skin tags, moles, or normal anatomical features could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural nursing. The searchers' reports about these intimate examinations became part of the official court record, subjecting your most private physical characteristics to public scrutiny and legal analysis. The forced interactions with afflicted girls during your examination create a theatrical performance that makes rational defense nearly impossible. When you're ordered to look directly at them, they claim your gaze causes them additional torment. When you're told to avert your eyes, they insist that your avoidance proves your guilt and supernatural power over them. If your presence in the courtroom triggers their convulsions, your diabolic influence is obvious. If they remain calm during your examination, you're clearly restraining your supernatural attacks to appear innocent. The magistrates carefully observe your facial expressions during these interactions, interpreting any emotion as evidence of your character and probable guilt. A slight smile might indicate diabolic pleasure at the girl's suffering, while a concerned frown suggests you're concentrating on maintaining your supernatural attacks. Your confusion about the proceedings appears suspicious, as does any sign of frustration with the illogical accusations. Even your attempts to appear respectful and cooperative can be twisted into evidence of calculated deception designed to hide your true diabolic nature. Historians still argue whether Salem's physical examinations reflected genuine medical beliefs or represented a form of sanctioned sexual violence disguised as legal procedure, but your experience reveals how these invasive tests strip away any remaining dignity while providing authorities with additional evidence to support predetermined conclusions about your guilt. The psychological impact of these examinations often proved as devastating as their physical invasiveness, breaking down defendants' emotional resilience and making them more likely to confess to imaginary crimes simply to end the humiliation. The social fabric of Salem Village disintegrates before your eyes as neighbors who have shared decades of communal life suddenly view each other through the lens of supernatural suspicion. Families that once borrowed tools, shared harvests, and supported each other through difficult times now whisper behind closed doors about diabolic signs they claim to have overlooked for years. Your presence as an obvious outsider provides a temporary focal point for these tensions, but you quickly realize that the community's paranoia extends far beyond concerns about strangers. It's eating away at relationships that once formed the foundation of their social order. The economic pressures that have been building in Salem Village for years suddenly find expression through witchcraft accusations. Property disputes that previously played out through legal channels or community mediation now get resolved through supernatural charges that can eliminate opponents entirely. When Thomas Putnam accuses neighbors of witchcraft, observers note his family's involvement in numerous land conflicts that would benefit from his accuser's removal. When merchants face competition from successful rivals, allegations of diabolic assistance in business dealings provide convenient explanations for others' prosperity while justifying their destruction. Your ignorance of these underlying conflicts makes you vulnerable to manipulation by people whose motives have nothing to do with genuine concern about witchcraft. Someone might encourage you to seek shelter with a particular family, not realizing that doing so aligns you with one faction in a bitter dispute about ministerial authority, property boundaries, or marriage arrangements. Your casual conversations with community members inadvertently provide information that gets twisted into evidence supporting various accusations, while your obvious confusion about local politics makes you an unreliable ally for anyone trying to navigate the increasingly dangerous social landscape. The children and teenagers who serve as primary accusers wield unprecedented power that completely inverts normal authority structures within Puritan society. Young girls who would typically spend their days in silent obedience to parents, ministers, and community elders suddenly find themselves at the center of legal proceedings, with magistrates hanging on their every word and adults competing for their favor. This dramatic reversal of social hierarchy creates opportunities for settling personal grudges, seeking attention, or gaining influence that would normally be impossible for people of their age and gender. Here's a fascinating psychological dynamic that modern analysts have identified. The accusers often targeted people who had previously held authority over them or had disciplined them for misbehavior. Former employers, strict neighbors, or adults who had criticized their conduct found themselves facing supernatural charges from young people who now possessed the power to destroy their accusers' reputations and lives. The witch trials temporarily created a world where traditional social hierarchies meant nothing compared to claims about spiritual warfare and diabolic influence. Your modern egalitarian values make you particularly vulnerable to these shifting power dynamics. You probably treat the afflicted girls with the same casual respect you'd show any young person, failing to demonstrate the elaborate deference that might protect you from their accusations. When they make claims about supernatural encounters, you respond with skepticism rather than the fearful reverence that community members have learned to display. Your inability to navigate their newfound authority makes you an easy target for their supernatural charges. The religious divisions within Salem Village add another layer of complexity to the social tensions you cannot understand. Supporters of the current minister Samuel Parris tend to be among the most enthusiastic witch hunters, while his opponents find themselves increasingly vulnerable to accusations that question their spiritual commitment. Your ignorance of these factional disputes means you might inadvertently align yourself with the wrong group, or worse, express opinions that mark you as hostile to whichever faction currently holds power. Historians still argue whether Salem's witch trials represented primarily religious hysteria, economic conflict, or political maneuvering, but your experience as an outsider reveals how these various tensions reinforced each other in ways that made rational resolution impossible. Community members couldn't address property disputes, generational conflicts, or religious disagreements through normal channels because supernatural charges had contaminated every aspect of social interaction. The breakdown of normal social trust creates an atmosphere where even family members begin suspecting each other of diabolic involvement. Husbands testify against wives, children accuse parents, and siblings provide evidence that sends their relatives to the gallows. Your lack of family connections initially seems like a disadvantage, but you gradually realize that having relatives in Salem might have made you even more vulnerable to accusations from people who knew your supposed loved one's weaknesses and secrets. Salem's legal system operates according to principles that would horrify modern attorneys and civil rights advocates. The presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of contemporary justice, simply doesn't exist in 17th century witch trials. Instead, the court assumes that God has revealed the truth through the afflicted girl's testimonies and the magistrate's divinely guided investigations. Your arrest itself becomes evidence of probable guilt, since authorities believe they're acting under divine direction in identifying threats to the community's spiritual welfare. The rules of evidence in Salem's courtroom accept testimony that no modern legal system would consider remotely credible. Dreams count as evidence, as do rumors, gossip, and statements made by people who weren't present during alleged supernatural encounters. When someone testifies that their neighbor told them about seeing your specter at a diabolic gathering, this hearsay becomes admissible proof of your participation in witchcraft. The court doesn't require corroboration, physical evidence, or verification of witnesses' credibility. Spiritual truth transcends such mundane concerns about factual accuracy. Your right to legal representation doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. While you might theoretically be allowed to speak in your own defense, the court doesn't provide attorneys, and hiring private counsel requires resources and social connections that you completely lack. Even if you could afford legal help, few lawyers would risk their own reputations by vigorously defending accused witches. The attorneys who do participate in witch trials typically focus on encouraging confessions or negotiating plea arrangements rather than challenging the fundamental assumptions underlying the charges. The burden of proof operates in reverse from modern legal standards. Instead of prosecutors needing to demonstrate your guilt beyond reasonable doubt, you must somehow prove your innocence despite facing accusations that exist entirely in the supernatural realm. How do you provide evidence that your spirit didn't visit someone's bedroom? How do you demonstrate that you haven't signed the devil's book when the alleged signature exists only in the spiritual dimension? The legal framework makes exoneration practically impossible for anyone unfortunate enough to face formal charges. Cross-examination of accusers follows rules that protect their testimonies from serious challenge. You cannot aggressively question the afflicted girl's credibility, since doing so implies doubt about their spiritual experiences and potential sympathy for the diabolic forces attacking them. When you try to point out inconsistencies in their stories, the magistrates interpret your careful attention to detail as evidence of your intimate knowledge of the supernatural events they're describing. Your ability to identify problems with their testimonies proves that you were present during the diabolic encounters rather than demonstrating their unreliability as witnesses. Here's a particularly insidious aspect of Salem's legal procedures. The court actively discourages testimony that might exonerate accused witches. Witnesses who vouch for defendants' good character risk being viewed as potential accomplices in diabolic conspiracies. People who provide alibis for accused individuals might themselves face accusations of participating in supernatural gatherings or covering up diabolic activities. This legal climate creates powerful incentives for community members to remain silent rather than defend their neighbors, leaving accused witches isolated and friendless during their trials. The sentencing phase offers limited options that favor confession over continued protests of innocence. Defendants who admit to witchcraft and provide detailed accounts of their supernatural activities typically receive lighter sentences, sometimes just imprisonment or public penance rather than execution. Those who maintain their innocence face the gallows, since their refusal to acknowledge obvious evidence of their guilt demonstrates the diabolic pride and deception characteristic of unrepentant witches. Your modern understanding of constitutional rights creates false expectations that make the legal proceedings even more traumatic. You expect due process, speedy trials, protection from self-incrimination, and other safeguards that won't exist for centuries. When these protections prove unavailable, your demands for fair treatment sound like arrogant challenges to legitimate authority rather than reasonable requests for basic justice. Historians still argue whether Salem's legal procedures reflected genuine theological conviction or cynical manipulation designed to produce predetermined outcomes, but your experience as a defendant reveals the practical impossibility of mounting an effective defense within their framework. The system channels accused individuals toward confession and execution while maintaining the appearance of legitimate judicial inquiry. The appeals process offers no meaningful opportunity to challenge wrongful convictions. Higher courts rarely overturn witch trial verdicts, viewing local magistrates as better positioned to understand community-specific supernatural threats. Even when appeals succeed, the delays involved mean spending additional months in jail under conditions that often prove fatal regardless of eventual legal outcomes. The confession gambit presents you with Salem's most psychologically devastating dilemma. Admit to crimes you didn't commit to save your life, or maintain your integrity while facing almost certain execution. The magistrates make this choice explicit during your interrogation, explaining that confessing witches typically receive mercy from the court, while those who persist in denying obvious evidence of their guilt demonstrate the diabolic pride that justifies the death penalty. Your modern moral framework, which values honesty and abhors false testimony, crashes headlong into the brutal pragmatism of 17th-century survival strategies. The confession process requires more than simply admitting guilt. You must provide detailed accounts of your supernatural activities that satisfy the court's expectations about diabolic behavior. The magistrates want to know when you signed the Devil's Book, which neighbors recruited you into witchcraft, what diabolic rituals you participated in, and how you learned to send your specter to torment innocent victims. Your confession needs to include specific names, dates, and locations that demonstrate your intimate knowledge of the supernatural conspiracy plaguing Salem Village. Your inability to provide convincing details about imaginary diabolic activities creates additional problems during confession attempts. When you try to admit guilt without real knowledge of witchcraft practices, your account sounds vague and unconvincing to magistrates who have heard dozens of detailed confessions from other accused individuals. They press you for specifics about diabolic meetings, supernatural powers, and relationships with other witches that you simply cannot provide without extensive knowledge of local people, places, and ongoing accusations. The naming requirement represents confession's most morally destructive element. The court expects confessing witches to identify their accomplices in diabolic activities, providing authorities with new targets for investigation and arrest. Your confession becomes worthless unless you implicate specific individuals in supernatural crimes, but naming names means destroying innocent people's lives to save your own. This requirement ensures that confessions perpetuate the witch trial cycle rather than resolving it, as each new accusation generates additional arrests and demands for further confessions. Your modern ethical training makes the naming requirement particularly torturous. You understand that bearing false witness against innocent people violates fundamental moral principles, but maintaining ethical integrity means accepting execution for crimes you didn't commit. The magistrates interpret your reluctance to name accomplices as evidence that you're only partially repentant, still protecting your diabolic associates despite claiming to renounce witchcraft. Partial confessions receive little mercy compared to complete admissions that provide authorities with actionable intelligence about other suspected witches. Here's a chilling detail that demonstrates confession's psychological complexity. Many accused witches began believing their own false testimonies after repeating them multiple times under intense pressure. The human mind's capacity for self-deception, combined with the detailed supernatural narratives they were required to construct, sometimes convinced confessing individuals that they had actually participated in the diabolic activities they described. This psychological phenomenon made confessions appear more credible to observers while creating genuine mental anguish for people who lost track of the distinction between their survival strategies and reality. The social consequences of confession extend far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. Confessing witches become permanently marked as individuals who consorted with diabolic forces, even if they receive mercy from the court. Their families face ongoing suspicion and social ostracism, their business relationships collapse, and their reputations remain tainted for generations. The community never fully trusts reformed witches, viewing them as potentially dangerous individuals whose repentance might be temporary or incomplete. Your lack of knowledge about Salem's social networks makes constructing believable confessions nearly impossible. Effective confessions require understanding local relationships, identifying plausible recruitment patterns, and describing diabolic meetings in locations that community members would recognize. Without this background knowledge, your attempts to confess sound fabricated to magistrates who are intimately familiar with the people and places you're trying to describe inaccurately. Historians still argue whether Salem's confessing witches genuinely believed their testimonies or consciously constructed false narratives for survival purposes. But your experience reveals the impossible moral position that confession requirements create for innocent defendants. You must choose between martyrdom for truth and survival through elaborate deception that destroys other innocent lives. The timing of confession affects its credibility and potential benefits. Early confessions, before formal trials begin, typically receive more favorable treatment than desperate last-minute admissions that appear calculated to avoid execution. However, early confession also requires predicting the court's expectations before you fully understand the charges against you or the specific details that authorities want to hear. The mechanics of execution in 1692 Salem make modern capital punishment seem almost humane by comparison. When the court sentences you to hang, you're not facing the relatively quick death that improved execution methods would eventually provide, but rather the brutal realities of 17th century gallows technology that often resulted in slow strangulation rather than the swift neck-breaking that proper hanging techniques can achieve. The Salem executioners lack both the scientific understanding and the equipment necessary to ensure rapid, merciful deaths for condemned prisoners. Your final days in jail become a countdown of psychological torture as you await transportation to Gallows Hill. The condemned prisoners face constant visits from ministers hoping to extract last-minute confessions, family members pleading with them to save themselves through admission of guilt, and curious community members who want to observe the behavior of actual witches before their execution. You have no privacy, no opportunity for quiet reflection, and no escape from the constant reminders that your death is approaching unless you agree to confess and implicate others in diabolic activities. The journey to Gallows Hill transforms your execution into a public spectacle that serves multiple purposes for Salem's community. The procession allows residents to demonstrate their rejection of diabolic influences by jeering at condemned witches, provides entertainment during an otherwise grim period of community crisis, and offers a final opportunity for prisoners to confess their crimes before facing divine judgment. Your cart ride through town becomes a gauntlet of hostile faces, thrown objects, and shouted accusations from people who view your execution as necessary protection for their families and community. The hanging itself reveals the primitive nature of 17th century execution technology. Salem's gallows consist of a simple wooden structure with a rope that lacks the sophisticated engineering features that later executioners would develop to ensure quick death through cervical fracture. Instead, you face the prospect of death by strangulation, which can take several agonizing minutes while your body convulses and struggles involuntarily. The crowd watches this process with a mixture of fascination and religious satisfaction, viewing your suffering as divine justice being served against enemies of their community. Your modern understanding of anatomy and physiology makes the anticipation of hanging even more terrifying than it would be for 17th century prisoners who lack detailed knowledge about what happens to human bodies during strangulation. You know exactly how oxygen deprivation affects brain function, understand the physical processes that cause consciousness to fade, and can anticipate the bodily sensations that accompany slow suffocation. This scientific knowledge becomes a curse rather than a blessing as you await execution. Here's a disturbing detail that popular accounts often minimize. Some Salem executions resulted in incomplete hanging when ropes broke or knots failed, requiring multiple attempts to complete the death sentence. These technical failures prolonged the condemned prisoner's suffering while providing additional entertainment for spectators who interpreted equipment problems as evidence of supernatural interference with divine justice. Survivors of failed hanging attempts faced immediate re-execution rather than reprieve, since their continued survival suggested diabolic assistance that made their deaths even more necessary. The religious context surrounding your execution transforms your death into a spiritual battle between good and evil forces. Ministers deliver sermons using your execution as an example of God's justice against diabolic influences, while spectators view your final moments as a test of your spiritual state. Any signs of fear, pain, or desperation become evidence of your awareness that you're facing divine punishment for supernatural crimes. Conversely, if you display courage or maintain innocence to the end, observers interpret this composure as diabolic support helping you face judgment without appropriate repentance. Your body's disposal after execution follows practices designed to prevent any potential resurrection or continued diabolic influence. Executed witches might be buried in unmarked graves, denied Christian funeral rites, or interred in locations specifically chosen to minimize supernatural contamination of consecrated ground. Your family, if you had any in Salem, would face social pressure to distance themselves from your memory and avoid any behaviors that might suggest continued loyalty to a confirmed witch. Historians still argue whether Salem's executions reflected genuine religious conviction or served primarily as social control mechanisms, but your experience reveals how public execution creates community solidarity through shared participation in sanctioned violence. The spectacle allows residents to demonstrate their rejection of supernatural threats while reinforcing social boundaries about acceptable behavior and beliefs. The financial costs associated with execution add a final insult to the legal proceedings that condemned you. Your estate, however limited, must pay for the rope, the executioner's services, and even the cart that transports your body to its final resting place. Beneath Salem's veneer of religious righteousness lies a web of economic motivations that transform supernatural accusations into profitable ventures for well-positioned community members. Property seizure laws allow authorities to confiscate assets belonging to condemned witches, creating powerful financial incentives for targeting individuals with valuable land, livestock, or business interests. Your modern perspective might assume that these seizures serve the community's collective good, but the reality involves specific individuals and families positioning themselves to benefit from their neighbors' destruction through carefully timed accusations and strategic legal maneuvering. The Putnam family's extensive involvement in witch trials correlates suspiciously with their long-standing disputes over land boundaries, inheritance rights, and political influence within Salem Village. When Thomas Putnam's daughter and accuses neighbors of witchcraft, observers note that many targets own property adjacent to Putnam holdings or have opposed the family's interests in previous legal proceedings. The supernatural charges provide convenient mechanisms for resolving property disputes that normal legal channels had failed to settle in the Putnams' favor, while the religious framework disguises economic motivations behind claims about protecting the community from diabolic threats. Your ignorance of Salem's property relationships makes you vulnerable to manipulation by people whose accusations serve hidden economic agendas. Someone might encourage your friendship with a particular family, not realizing that doing so aligns you with parties in bitter inheritance disputes, boundary conflicts, or business rivalries that could ultimately determine your fate when supernatural charges begin flying. Your casual conversations inadvertently provide ammunition for accusations, while your obvious wealth, even if limited by modern standards, makes you an attractive target for asset seizure following conviction. The tavern and in business in Salem operates according to licensing systems that create opportunities for eliminating commercial competition through witchcraft accusations. When established tavern keepers face challenges from new competitors, allegations of diabolic assistance in attracting customers provide legal grounds for shutting down rival establishments while seizing their assets for the community's benefit. Your attempts to find lodging or purchase meals unwittingly involve you in these commercial conflicts, potentially marking you as either a threat to established businesses or a valuable asset worth destroying to access your resources. Here's a particularly cynical detail that reveals the trial's economic dimensions. Some of Salem's most enthusiastic witch hunters acquired significant wealth through their participation in property seizures and asset redistribution following executions. These individuals combined religious rhetoric about protecting the community with careful attention to which accused witches owned the most valuable assets, timing their accusations to maximize financial benefits while maintaining plausible claims about spiritual motivations for their involvement in supernatural investigations. The debt collection system creates additional opportunities for transforming financial disputes into supernatural charges. When creditors face difficulty collecting debts from borrowers, accusations of witchcraft provide alternative mechanisms for recovering money through asset seizure laws that accompany conviction. Your inability to establish credit relationships or provide financial references makes you particularly vulnerable to accusations from people who might benefit from claiming you owe them money or have damaged their business interests through diabolic interference. Marriage and inheritance patterns in Salem Village reveal how supernatural accusations serve family financial strategies that extend across generations. When elderly property owners face pressure from younger relatives eager to inherit valuable assets, witchcraft charges can accelerate the transfer process while providing moral justification for what might otherwise appear to be callous greed. Your lack of family connections initially protects you from these generational conflicts, but it also eliminates potential advocates who might defend your interests if accusations arise. The ministerial salary disputes that divide Salem Village create economic pressures that influence supernatural accusations in ways that most community members don't consciously recognize. Supporters of different ministers compete for control over church finances, property management, and taxation policies that determine their own economic well-being. When these conflicts escalate into witchcraft charges, the supernatural framework disguises political and economic disagreements behind claims about spiritual warfare and diabolic influence. Historians still argue whether Salem's economic motivations operated consciously or subconsciously within the community's decision-making processes. But your experience as an outsider reveals how financial interests shaped accusation patterns regardless of the participants' stated intentions. People who stood to benefit economically from their neighbor's destruction found supernatural justifications for pursuing their material interests while maintaining sincere beliefs about protecting their community from diabolic threats. The legal costs associated with defending against witchcraft charges create additional financial pressure that pushes accused individuals toward confession rather than prolonged resistance. Your inability to pay for adequate legal representation, witness fees, and court expenses makes conviction more likely while ensuring that any remaining assets get consumed by the legal process rather than benefiting your survivors. By autumn of 1692, Salem's witch trials have reached a crescendo of madness that even their most enthusiastic supporters begin to recognize as unsustainable. The accusations have spread far beyond the original targets: poor women, social outcasts, and community troublemakers, to include respected ministers, wealthy merchants, and even the governor's wife. When Increase Mather's influential essay Cases of Conscience questions the reliability of spectral evidence, and his son Cotton Mather begins expressing doubts about the proceedings despite his earlier support, the intellectual foundation supporting the trial starts crumbling faster than a house built on Salem's marshy soil. Your hypothetical survival to this point, assuming you somehow avoided execution, confession, or death in jail, allows you to witness the psychological mechanisms that finally bring the trials to an end. The same community dynamics that fueled the initial hysteria begin working in reverse as people recognize that the accusation process has spiraled completely out of control. When accusers start targeting individuals whose guilt seems implausible even to true believers, the credibility of the entire enterprise collapses. The afflicted girl's power reaches its natural limits when they overreach and accuse people whose social standing makes their supposed diabolic involvement absurd to contemplate. The economic costs of the trials create practical pressures that religious fervor cannot overcome indefinitely. The community has spent enormous resources on investigations, imprisonments, and executions while productive citizens languish in jail or flee to safer locations. Farms go unharvested, businesses close, and normal economic activity grinds to a halt as everyone focuses on the supernatural crisis consuming their society. The material consequences of prolonged witch hunting begin outweighing the spiritual benefits that initially justified the proceedings, creating incentives for finding resolution rather than continuation. Governor William Phips finally intervenes in October 1692, dissolving the Court of Oyer and Terminer and establishing new legal procedures that exclude spectral evidence from witch trial proceedings. This administrative decision effectively ends the trials by removing their primary evidentiary foundation, though Phips frames his action as a procedural refinement rather than a fundamental rejection of witchcraft prosecutions. The political language surrounding this intervention carefully avoids admitting that the previous proceedings were fundamentally flawed, instead suggesting that improved procedures will better serve justice while protecting innocent citizens from false accusations. Your modern perspective allows you to recognize patterns that 17th century observers couldn't fully understand about mass hysteria, social scapegoating, and community trauma. The Salem trials represent a textbook example of how rational individuals can participate in irrational collective behavior when social pressures, economic incentives, and ideological frameworks align to create perfect storms of persecution. The same psychological mechanisms that drove Salem's witch trials appear throughout human history in different forms: political purges, ethnic cleansing, religious persecution, and ideological witch hunts that substitute different belief systems for supernatural accusations. Here's a sobering detail that demonstrates the trial's ultimate futility. None of the underlying social tensions that contributed to Salem's witch crisis received meaningful resolution through the supernatural prosecutions. Property disputes continued, religious divisions persisted, economic inequalities remained, and generational conflicts endured long after the last execution. The trials provided temporary outlets for community frustrations while ultimately exacerbating the very problems they were supposed to solve, leaving Salem Village more divided and traumatized than before the supernatural crisis began. The aftermath reveals the psychological costs that mass hysteria inflicts on entire communities, not just its immediate victims. Survivors struggled with guilt about their participation in destroying innocent lives. Families remained divided by accusations and counter-accusations, and the community's social fabric required years to repair. Some participants never recovered from their involvement in the trials, carrying lifelong trauma about their roles in judicial murders that they eventually recognized as fundamentally unjust. Historians still argue whether Salem's witch trials could have been prevented through different leadership, alternative social institutions, or improved legal procedures, but your experience as a time-traveling observer reveals how multiple systemic failures combined to create conditions where rational people supported irrational policies. The trials weren't simply the product of individual evil or collective insanity, but rather the predictable result of social structures that prioritized conformity over critical thinking, authority over evidence, and fear over compassion. The final irony of your imaginary Salem experience is that survival would have required abandoning every moral principle and intellectual standard that modern education teaches us to value. Success demanded conformity, deference, and willingness to participate in collective delusions rather than the independent thinking, ethical integrity, and rational skepticism that we consider essential for decent human behavior. As the last leaves of autumn drift down onto Gallows Hill, where 19 innocent souls met their end, you begin to understand that Salem's tragedy wasn't really about witchcraft at all. It was about what happens when fear overwhelms reason, when community pressure crushes individual conscience, and when good people convince themselves that terrible actions serve righteous purposes. The trials finally end not because anyone admits their fundamental error, but because the machinery of persecution exhausts itself through its own excess, leaving behind a community forever scarred by the knowledge of what ordinary neighbors can do to each other when circumstances align just wrong. You realize now that your modern advantages, education, scientific knowledge, rational skepticism, and moral principles wouldn't have saved you from Salem's madness. In fact, these very qualities would have marked you as dangerous, different, and deserving of destruction. The same critical thinking skills that we consider essential for navigating today's world would have sealed your fate in a community that valued conformity over curiosity, authority over evidence, and fear over compassion. As you drift off to sleep tonight, safe in your contemporary world with its imperfect but real protections for individual rights and rational discourse, remember that the human capacity for collective delusion hasn't disappeared. It's simply found new forms and different targets. The Salem Witch Trials remind us that civilization's veneer remains thin, that moral progress can reverse quickly under pressure, and that each generation must actively choose reason over hysteria, evidence over accusation, and compassion over fear. Sweet dreams, and may you never face the terrible choice between truth and survival that Salem's victims confronted in those dark months of 1692.